Well, thank you first of all for the introduction and the invitation to speak tonight. I've been coming to Newcastle a lot of late, and I've got to say, it's always a pleasure. It's somewhat less of a pleasure when you can only catch the train almost to Newcastle, but it's always a pleasure. And it really does feel very much like a second home, I think, to myself. I'd like to also acknowledge that we're meeting on the land of the Awabakal people and pay my respects to not only the Awabakal people but the Worimi people, which is the Hunter in Newcastle is situated on that land, on their land, which they've never ceded sovereignty over. And I pay my respects to those elders past and present of the land upon which we're meeting, including, I might add firmly, for the record, the land that is under the railway corridor. It's only been 6 months today since I successfully moved to have the resolution to establish the inquiry into the problems in planning in Hunter and Newcastle. And I've got to say it's been a very busy and pretty intense 6 months, and Linda and I were just talking about, we've been on a number of committees over the last 6 months, but two in particular have just exploded, been an enormous amount of work, primarily because of the interest that's been generated in the public. One of them was the police bugging scandal inquiry that Linda and I were both on, and I think that occupied one hemisphere of my brain for a period of time. And then at the same time, we had the Newcastle planning inquiry going, and that was the other hemisphere of my brain. And I apologise to my family and anyone else for the period when we were doing that work and talking with communities, receiving hundreds of submissions, reading them, trying to get on top of them, have public hearings. And I hope many of you have read the reports online. I think Linda's got a couple of reports that she's got to hand out. Is that right, Linda?
They're actually Tim asked me.
Okay, well, Tim's asked me to bring.
I might want to see Tim.
All right. I think I've got one spare copy, but I'd hope you go online and read the reports. Because I've got to say this, when we were doing the reports, particularly the reports on planning, one of the key things that was an objective for myself, and I think for a majority on the committee, was that we wouldn't be guilty of what the planning system has done time and time and time again with the submissions that many of you have made on planning matters, whether it's about the rail, it's about the East End High, it's about the urban renewal system, it's about a coal mine, or it's about countless things that you've made submissions of. What we intended to do was actually read and digest and incorporate your submissions and your thoughts into our report. Now, many of you may be critical about the extent to which we've done that, but I've got to say that the goal of all of us, I think, at least who form the majority, was to make sure we actually listened. We tried to understand as best we could the complexity of the issues, and then we let your expertise inform the recommendations and the findings of the report. And I hope that that's the report that you read. Because there's enormous wisdom in the community. And standing here, looking at you, I see people with enormous expertise, enormous commitment to their local parks, to their local rail, to their local communities. I see two Lord Mayors, my colleague Linda Volz from the Upper House. I see Councillor Doyle from Newcastle Council, Councillor Osborne, your local member Tim Crackenthorpe, and others. But I also see amongst the rest of you community leaders who are trying to pitch a different vision for Newcastle from the property council dystopia that I think has taken hold at a state government level. And if there is one recommendation that I think really gets to the nub of the problem, it was something that the Lord Mayor raised earlier. It was the recommendation that we have a single, cohesive, unified planning authority for Newcastle, and it be democratically accountable to the local residents, and that it be the local city council. And that is... I endeavoured to put some of my thoughts in relation to that into an opinion piece in the Newcastle Herald today, which really focused on Newcastle. But that was actually a cut-down version of a slightly larger opinion piece. You know, that's the life of a politician, having your opinions winnowed out by the media. But it was a cut-down version of a slightly larger opinion piece, which actually compared and contrasted Newcastle with Sydney. Because sitting here in Newcastle, sometimes you think, well, this this devil's brew of planning and land ownership authorities has surely got to be unique to Newcastle. Only a city that is so routinely ignored and humiliated by Macquarie Street could have this mess to live but I've got to tell you, the mess that is Newcastle is actually mirrored to a similar extent in Sydney and other local council areas around the state, but particularly Newcastle and Sydney. It's a compare and contrast. So in Newcastle, we've got the Hunter Development Corporation, and we've got urban growth, and we've got joint regional planning panels, and we've got the Planning Assessment Commission, and we've got the Department of Planning. And then filling in the gaps, picking up the crumbs that haven't been eaten off that table, that smorgasbord of property interests and state government authorities, picking up the crumbs is the City of Newcastle Council, which basically deals with the rest. Now, how can any planning authority endeavour to come up with a cohesive solution to Newcastle when you've got the Hunter Development Corporation dealing with a bit on the waterfront, you've got urban growth squatting on a huge part of the CBD, you've got the state government coming in and imposing its wishes on a strip all the way from Wickham to the coast. You've got a joint regional planning panel, a bizarre mix of state government appointees, state government dominated appointees and local council appointees making the decisions on the really big developments. Except for if they get bigger than that, the decision making is taken over by the Planning Assessment Commission, which is a bunch of notional experts appointed by the planning minister to do a job on you on coal loaders and the like. And then, is it any wonder that it's a mess? And is it any wonder that it's not a unified vision? Because there's no one authority with control. And what's the obvious authority putting control of that? Well, it's Newcastle City Council. Now go to Sydney and you think, well, surely the state's biggest city, it's got to be slightly more rational. But we find the same thing again. The single biggest building site in Australia is Barangaroo on the western approach of the CBD, 22 hectares of public land, which has basically been handed over to a single developer called Lendlease. And decision making over what applications are allowed to proceed, what land deals are done on that 22 hectares, and you think 22 hectares right next to the Sydney CBD, what an extraordinary valuable site. Are those decisions being made by the City Council? No, they're not. They're being made by the Barangaroo Development Authority. Another separate authority. Does it sound familiar? Sitting right there on the waterside edge of the CBD, making all those decisions, only interested in what the commercial outcome is for them on their little patch, on the harbour side, on the western harbour side of the CBD. And of course, they've gone for an extraordinary overdevelopment on that part of the site. It's likely to be almost unsustainable in terms of public transport in the city. And then to top it all off, we have an appallingly large casino being built by a particularly well-connected Mr. Packer in the centre of it. And if you think that's bad, well, you just have to go either side of Barangaroo. A huge stretch of land in Barangaroo heading all the way around to Balmain called the Bays Precinct. That's all been handed over to urban growth. And urban growth is sitting in there trying to come hooking up deals with private developers on that stretch of land. And around the other side of the Harbour Foreshore, what used to be the Sydney Harbour Foreshore Authority is now being subsumed also by urban growth as landowner and developer around the balance of the shore. And urban growth has also been given a huge swathe at the centre of Sydney, which is called the Everleigh Railway Corridor, which runs all the way from McDonaldtown to Redfern. And then, of course, there's the Central Sydney Planning Authority, which kind of mirrors the JRPP, the Joint Regional Planning Panel, but the Central Sydney Planning Authority is a state government-dominated decision maker, which has a couple of patsies from the local council on it, and they make the big decisions on all the big high-rises in the centre of Sydney. And then the council and the elected councillors, just like in Newcastle, are dealing with the crumbs that fall off the table and trying to make the whole thing work as best they can. And of course, it's incoherent, utterly incoherent. The two biggest cities in this state with the same incoherent mess. And why do we have that? Well, we have it because for the last 2 decades, state councils have had a war on local councils, state governments have had a war on local councils to seize their planning powers, to cripple their financial autonomy, and to basically try and delegitimise them so as they can centralise power in Macquarie Street, centralise power in the Department of Planning, and then impose separate statutory authorities and other bodies to make the decisions in your local area. And you end up with such a mess that nobody in Newcastle knows who's responsible for the decisions. You can't get your head around it. It's so hideously complicated. Same in Sydney. There are a series of recommendations in the report. One is to break the connection between urban growth and the Department of Planning. How can you have the same department being the developer and the decision maker? You can't. But of course, the state government seems perfectly comfortable with that. We have the obvious recommendation to centralise planning authority in a democratically accountable council. And of course, sometimes you'll elect good councillors and sometimes you'll elect rotten councillors. But at least you'll be able to throw them out in 4 years' time if you don't like them. And that's about democratic accountability. We've got key recommendations in there about what to do with the gross mismanagement of process that ended up with that appalling overdevelopment being proposed for the east end of the city. We have recommendations to reinstate the rail line. And I would hope, as I said at the beginning, that what we've produced in the report is a series of recommendations that reflect the combined collective wisdom of Newcastle and the Greater Hunter region. I think we've done that as best we can. I'm happy to take your questions and criticisms and because that's what being democratically accountable is. But what I think we see in here is a roadmap for a unified, positive future for Newcastle and the Greater Hunter. It's a roadmap for planning decisions being done with integrity. It's a roadmap for listening to the community, not just inviting them in, getting them to do a submission, giving them a cup of tea, patting them on the head and moving them out of the room. It's a roadmap that shows how you can actually listen to the community and respond to the submissions you get and the decisions you make. Because that's what's missing in planning. Indeed, that's what's missing in government across the state. So, thank you all so much for the enormous assistance you provided to us in delivering this report. This is really your report that we just had the privilege, with the great assistance of a very professional Secretariat of Parliament, but we had the privilege to produce, which reflects your collective wisdom. Thank you so much.